believe last time we got to this problem, and this is where we stopped. Is this correct for everyone? This is where we are in the notes? Yes, okay, very good. So Cougar Test Laboratories does heat testing and stress testing on materials and operates at capacity under its current simple costing system. Now remember, at this point, we have two types of systems that we're looking at. We've got simple costing, which used one allocation rate, and we do activity-based costing, which is multiple activity rates. Okay, so you got to be able to pick out this information. So currently, we're using a simple costing system. That's what we currently are using. Cougar aggregates all operating costs of $1,280,000 into a single overhead cost pool. Cougar calculates a rate per test hour of $16. Okay, so that's our current simple costing rate that we use to allocate all costs, $16. And the way we got that is to take our total estimated overhead of $1,280,000, and we're allocating it based on test hours. So we divide it by the total test hours. So that's nothing new. That's the way we know how to create our rate and allocate the cost. All right, so heat tests uses 50,000 test hours and stress tests uses 30,000 test hours. Latham Clare, Cougar's controller, believes that there is enough variation in test procedures and cost structures to establish separate costing and billing rates for heat tests and stress tests. The market for test services is becoming competitive. Without this information, and we saw that last time, we saw how having miscosted information can cause us to go out of business. Okay, so that's what they're thinking here, is their competition is getting, or the competition is getting more fierce, so they have to be cost competitive. All right, so Clare divides Cougar's cost into 4 activity cost categories. The first one are direct cost. Okay, so keep that in mind. Those are direct costs. We know direct costs are directly traceable back to the products. There's nothing we have to allocate there. The last 3 of those, these are indirect or overhead costs. So those we're going to have to allocate on some method. Now, once we do all this, the ultimate question is, once we calculate the cost per test hour, we're going to explain the reasons why these numbers differ from the $16 per test hour. Now, we should already probably know the answer to that even without seeing the rates that we're going to calculate under activity-based costing. But that's the ultimate goal in this problem. Okay, is to compare simple costing with activity-based costing and what the ultimate outcome could possibly be. All right. So let's go to the little spreadsheet. You should have this in the lecture notes if you print these out. All right. If not, then got a lot of writing to do. But hopefully you have these in front of you. So the first thing we're going to do is do the direct labor, which is given to us. They tell us in the story. So I brought the pertinent information here in this little blue box. This is just direct labor. We're going to do these in pieces. Okay, so right now we're just doing the direct labor part. They tell us that total direct labor is $240,000. That's total. These costs can be directly traced to heat test and stress test. So $183,000 is going directly to heat tests, and $60,000 is going directly to stress tests. Now remember, our ultimate goal is to get a per test hour. So notice I have per hour for each. So this is almost like 2 columns within this one column here. And this is the number we're ultimately looking for, because that will be the total cost of each test hour once we're finished. So now I need this direct labor on a per hour basis. Well, they tell me in the story, if we go back, they tell me that there are 50,000 heat tests hours and stress test uses 30,000 test hours. Okay, so I'm going to write this in so I don't forget it. So 50,000 test hours and stress test uses 30,000 test hours. Okay, so that was given to us. Now remember, I want it on a per hour basis. So to get that, I would take the 183 and divide it by the 50,000 test hours, and that would give me that on a per hour basis. I'll take over here the 60,000, divide it by the 30,000 hours, and that one I can do in my head. That's $2 per test hour. 66 Okay. All right. Questions on anything we did there? Now, in that one, we didn't have to calculate a rate, right? Because direct costs are directly traceable back to a product. Now, in the next three, we're going to have to follow our process. Step one, calculate the rate, allocate the cost. Okay, so 2 steps in each process. All right. So let's go to the equipment-related costs. All right. Okay. So again, step one, and I'm going to do it down here to give myself enough room, is to calculate the rate, okay, for this particular activity, equipment-related cost. So the information, again, I've put here in the center. Equipment-related cost of $400,000 are allocated to heat tests and stress tests on the basis of test hours. So the first thing we have to do is figure out the allocation base. In this case, it actually is test hours. Okay, that's our allocation base. So we're going to take our total cost, so 400,000, and divide it by our total allocation base. Well, in this case, it's test hours. So again, we have 50,000 heat test hours and 30,000 hours to stress test. So that's 80,000 hours total. And that will give me my rate. It's at $5, I think. Now we use the rate to allocate the cost, and we're only doing equipment-related costs right now. Okay, so we're going to take that $5 rate and multiply it times the activity consumed by each type of test. So heat test took 50,000 hours, and that's $250,000, I believe. And my rate times the consumption of stress test hours was 30,000 hours, and that's 150,000, I believe. So we're part of the way there. Now we need to take and get our per hour number. So again, the 250 divided by the 50,000 hours, whatever that happens to be. And in this case, it's actually the same as the rate because the test hours is our allocation base. But that's not always going to be the case, particularly with these next two. Okay, so that's not always going to be the rate number. And then we're going to do the same thing over here, $150,000 divided by the total hours, and that's $5 still. Okay. Now again, we're taking this number, dividing it by that to get my rate. Okay, so that's what we're doing in every single one. All right, that's the process. Take the total divided by the number of hours to get the cost per hour. So remember, take the rate times whatever the activity is consuming. Okay, so in this case, the heat tests are consuming 50,000 test hours. The stress tests are consuming 30,000 test hours. Because for equipment-related cost, the cost driver was test hours. But for the next two types of cost, test hours is not the allocation base. You have to be careful. So remember, since chapter 3, when we started talking about job costing, we know the first step is to calculate the rate. The second step is to take the rate and allocate the cost. Well, that would give us the cost in this total column. Can you see my mouse moving at all? You can. Okay, very good. So that would give us this number in the total column. So up to this point, that's all old stuff. This problem actually wants you to go a step further. It wants it on the basis of test hour. So we would have to then take this amount, divide it by the total of test hours for this particular test, and that would give us our rate. So you'd have to do that for each one. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at setup cost. So setup cost, the total was $385,000. This is the amount of cost that we're trying to allocate. And they're allocated based on setup hours. And heat tests require 13,500 setup hours. Stress tests require 4,000 setup hours. Step one is to calculate the rate. So you take your total overhead cost, in this case indirect cost, divided by total allocation base. So 17,500 hours gives us $22 per setup hour. So again, it's pretty important to go ahead and stick this verbiage at the end of your rate, because that's going to help you see the rest of it. Okay, so this is $22 per setup hour. So then we're going to multiply it times the number of setup hours consumed by each test. So heat test consumed 13,500 hours, gives us $297,000. But again, I want that on a per test basis. Well, the number of test hours for the heat test were 50,000 hours. So $297,000 divided by 50,000 hours gives me $5.94 per hour. For a stress test, my rate was still $22 per setup hour. You multiply it times the number of setup hours consumed by stress test, which were 4,000 hours. That gives me a total cost of $88,000. Divide that by the number of hours consumed by the stress test, which were 30,000 hours, gives me the cost per test hour for our setup cost, $2.93 per hour. Okay, any questions on setup costs? Everybody's okay? All right. So let's look at cost of designing. I won't go through this one as in detail as I did the other ones, just for sake of time. So look at cost of designing test and let me know if you have any questions about that one. So we get $3.36 per test hour for heat test and $2.80 per hour for stress tests. And our rate was $60 per design test hour to get our total numbers here. Now we want to get the totals here. So a couple of ways you could do this. You could take the total all the way down each column and get the total, and then take the total and divide by number of test hours. Total divided by number of test hours would then give me this number. Or you could take the per test hour numbers and just add down. But don't forget the direct labor. That's part of the cost. Okay, so you'd have to do $3.66 plus $5 plus $5.94 plus $3.36 to give me the $17.96 per hour. Okay, another thing you could always think of to kind of check yourself is this was the cost we were trying to allocate. That was the total cost in the main problem, $1,280,000. That's the amount we should have allocated to all of our activities. Well, if you take the 898 plus the 382, that should equal the 1,280,000. Right now, if you remember back to the main problem, it said under simple costing, which is what we're currently using, and we know that simple costing is not as accurate as activity-based costing, which we're looking at right now. Under simple costing, we think every test cost us $16. Regardless of what kind of test it is, whether it's a heat test or stress test, we think it costs us $16. So keep in mind, our competition is probably using this method right here. So look, for example, let's just go back to what we did kind of last time, just make up some profit. Let's say that everybody in our industry adds $1 to the cost, and that's what we charge for a test. So under our current system, which is simple costing, we think every test costs us $16. So we're going to charge $17 for every test we give. You with me so far? Everybody following me? Okay, so we're going to charge $17. How many heat tests do you think we're going to sell? And keep in mind, the heat tests are really costing us $18, and we're charging $17. So for all those heat tests, because we're going to sell a lot, because our competition is charging $19. Do you see that? So for every heat test we sell, we're losing $1. Are we going to sell any stress tests? We're selling them for $17. If we do, and if we're lucky enough to sell any stress tests, they're going to subsidize the losses on our heat tests. Do you see it? Because we're selling stress tests for $17 a piece, and our competition is selling them for about $14 a piece. Okay. So we're going to make about 17, a little over $4 per stress test if we're able to sell any of them. If someone doesn't do their research and search out the best price, then we may be lucky enough to sell one. Okay. Does that make sense? What we just talked about there? Okay. So it's so very important to know what your true costs are. And this is just showing us once again that activity-based costing is way more accurate than simple costing, using just one rate to allocate all of our cost. Because we can see that certain tests use more hours of certain things than others, and they go through different activities. So you can't just use test hours as an appropriate cost driver. It wouldn't be appropriate for all of our tests. All right. Any questions, other questions before I move on? All right. So here we have automotive products, designs and produces automotive parts. In 2009, actual variable manufacturing overhead is $308,600. That's our total overhead, $308,600. AP's simple costing system allocates overhead to its three customers. So we have three customers. We have United Motors, Holden Motors, and Leland Vehicle, three customers, based on machine hours. So that's our simple costing allocation base or cost driver, machine hours, and prices its contracts based on full costs. One of its customers has regularly complained of being charged non-competitive prices. So AP's controller, Devin Smith, realizes that it's time to examine the consumption of overhead resources more closely. He knows that there are three main departments that consume overhead. Here they are: design, engineering, and production. Interviews with department personnel and examination of time records yield the following detailed information. So here I'm giving you all this information: the cost driver, the total overhead allocated to each department. Again, here's the total overhead, which ultimately is how much we need to allocate, no matter what system we're using, simple or activity-based costing. So our objective: compute the overhead allocated to each customer using simple costing. Okay, simple costing. So again, we did this last time. So once we learn something new, it's really hard sometimes to go back and do it the old way, but we still need to know how to do it both ways. So again, the simple costing is using machine hours as its one allocation base. So under simple costing, how many rates will we have? One rate, right? If we were doing activity-based costing right now, how many rates would we have? We'd have three. Very good. Three activities, one rate for every activity. But in this case, we're just doing simple costing right now. Okay, so again, the process is the same. Calculate your rate, which you only have one, then use that rate to allocate the cost to your three customers. Okay, so I'll give you a couple minutes to work on this on your own, and then we'll come back together and take a look at it. All right. All right, let's take a look and see how we did on this one. So the first thing we have to note is the cost driver for simple costing. It is not CAD design hours, so we don't need those. It's not engineering hours. We don't need those. It's machine hours. And here is our total machine hours. If we add all those guys up, that would give us our total. And we also know our total overhead cost. So we can easily calculate our rate. So our total overhead cost divided by total allocation base. So that would be, let's see if I can find it here. It's right there. Okay, so 308,600, this number, divided by the 4,000 total machine hours. Okay, so that's where we're getting that rate of $77.15 per machine hour. So again, that's step one, to calculate the rate. Step two is to take the rate and allocate the cost to our three customers. So United, Holden, and Leland. So we can do that now. So United, $77.15 times the number of machine hours consumed by United. Because remember, we take the rate, multiply it times the consumption of the allocation base. So United used 120 machine hours, 9258, perfect. Holden used 2,800 machine hours. So our rate times 2,800. And Leland used 1,080 machine hours. Now, again, remember we have a check figure. All three of these things added up should equal that 308,000 $600. All right, so let's get some terminology in your notes. I know we've talked about it a couple of times, but I want to make sure it's in your notes. This idea of subsidization or cross-subsidization is when one product is subsidizing another. So this is when the over-costed product absorbs too much cost, making it seem less profitable than it really is because it's absorbed too much cost. We've overcosted it. It's when the under-costed product is left with too little cost, making it seem more profitable than it really is. Okay, so we've seen this a few times, and we're going to see it here in just a second. It's when one product is subsidizing another because of our inefficiency at assigning costs. Is where that comes down to. So to not make this happen is why we need to use activity-based costing. Okay, so we're more accurate with our costing, more efficient. All right, let's go to our last problem, which actually is the same problem you just did, except now using the exact same information, we're going to allocate these costs to our 3 customers based on activity-based costing. So again, you just told me a few minutes ago, there's 3 activities. Therefore, we'll have 3 rates. And now you're going to allocate the cost to those 3 customers based on those 3 activities, okay? I want you to go beyond this problem. I want you to think about the 2 that we just did. So you just did simple costing, and you're about to do the activity-based costing method. So just as we've done before, I want you to compare them. What is happening under simple costing? Which product is undercosted? Which product is overcosted? Okay, which one's subsidizing the other, in other words. Okay, so think through that process. Don't just calculate the numbers. Think about it, okay? All right, so now we're using activity-based costing to allocate our total amount of overhead cost. But you have to be careful with this. We're only allocating these individual costs per activity. Okay, so that was step 1, to calculate the rate based on the overhead cost in that activity divided by the allocation base. All right, so let's take a look and see what that looked like. So these are the rates you should have got. So part 1 is the rates. So I got $100 per CAD design hour for design. I got $80 per engineering hour for engineering and $60 per machine hour for production. Any questions on calculating the rate or the rates? The rate for each activity. So again, 3 activities equal 3 rates. I'm just scanning through everybody to see if I see any concern on faces. All right, everybody's good? All right, so step 2 then is we take these rates to allocate the cost. So that's step 2. So the rate for design was $100. Now, some of you be very careful with this. If you'll write out what your rate is, it's not 100, it's not $100. It's $100 per CAD design hour. That will help you to see what I'm supposed to multiply it by. Okay, because some of you wanted to multiply it times $39,000. Well, we know we're not multiplying it times 30 by dollars because it's based on CAD design hours. Okay, so just go ahead and write out the whole rate like I did here with dollars and its name. That way it makes it so much easier when you're multiplying it through, okay? All right, so I took the $100 rate, multiplied it through, the $80 rate, multiplied it through, the $60 rate, multiplied it through. And I got $39,000, which is a check figure. They tell me that when I added all those across, 29,640, and lo and behold, my total of 308,600 was allocated to all 3 of my clients. 23,800 got allocated to United, 192,800 got allocated to Holden, and 92,000 got allocated to Leland. Any questions with those numbers? Did everybody get these totals down here? 23,800, 192,800, 92,000? If not, you're well on your way to getting them, I hope. Yes? All right. Now, the last part, which I asked you to kind of think about in your teams, was if you go back, now at the top of my screen right now is the simple costing version. At the bottom is the activity-based costing version. So at the top is what we're currently doing. This is what we think our customers are costing us. At the bottom is really what they're costing us, okay? So who is this customer that keeps complaining? Who do you think is complaining about being charged non-competitive prices? Who's complaining? This is what we think Holden is costing us. So we're charging them maybe $250, but this is what actually Holden is costing us. So we probably should be charging them around $210, $215, something like that, whatever. Okay, so they're the ones complaining. Leland and United, they're pretty happy, wouldn't you think? Because Holden is subsidizing both of them. Okay, so Holden is subsidizing both United and Leland. So what's going to happen if we fix this problem? United and Leland are going to be mad. Holden's going to be happy. United and Leland are going to be happy because their costs are going to go way up. So we may end up losing them as clients. So you always have to think about these things. You know, you have to explain things to your clients. Of course, that's management's job, not the accountant. The accountant is just to prepare this information, give it to management, and that's it. Okay, we can give some advice on what should happen, but it's ultimately management's job to smooth it over with the clients.